Greetings, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this panel, which is a part of the year-long ROMID Dialogue Initiative co-organized by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. October 7th, terrorist attacks on Israel has sparked a devastating crisis across the region. Iran has for the first time launched a direct attack on Israel. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has remained unresolved. And the threat imposed by Iran backed groups on the maritime security and the security of the region as a whole has not faded. The crisis has already had a visible impact on global economy, from the impact of attacks by the Houthis on seaborne shipments in the Red Sea to the global energy prices in the aftermath of Iran-Israel direct confrontation. Today, we will focus on one specific aspect of these events, that is Israeli economy. Our excellent speakers will unpack the state of Israeli economy since October the 7th from various angles. I'm going to introduce our excellent speakers one by one as the order of our panel goes. I will start with Professor Asher Blass, who is the CEO of Economic Research and Consulting Group and a former chief economist at Bank of Israel. Very welcome to you, Professor Blass. With the defense expenditure ramping up, psychological pressure of the war on the domestic market increasing, how do you assess the economic impact of this crisis so far?
Well, you spoke about defense. The Israeli defense expenditures for several decades has been on a downwards trend. We still spend quite a bit more than most Western countries, but the trend was down. And that is something that is obviously going to change in the foreseeable future. There is a fair amount of uncertainty, both in terms of what will be needed this year, because no one can really predict with any certainty how the military situation will develop. But I think there's also uncertainty in the long run. How does this process develop over time? Will the Israeli military be considerably bigger? Will there be more needs for reserves? Will something be done to draft the ultra-Orthodox? Those are big questions. In terms of the overall effect on the budget, this year's budget is problematic in many ways. First of all, the deficit is probably too large. The composition of spending is not great, and reforms have been put on hold. All of this together creates a difficult background for future growth and economic progress.
Thank you very much. You talked about deficit that has been growing and reforms that have been postponed. But can you talk us through a little bit in more details what reforms exactly? Because I'm very much familiar with the other non-Israeli Middle Eastern economies. When we talk about reforms, usually there is a similar pattern running across the region in terms of the economic reforms that is needed, in terms of labor force reform, in terms of participation of women into the economy. To what extent Israel does share these challenges, or to what extent Israeli challenges are unique to Israeli economy?
Well, the situation with the participation of women in the labor force is definitely different in Israel from that in surrounding countries, probably equivalent to or close to equivalent to many Western countries. The reforms, I think, have to do more with opening up markets. Israel is a developed economy, yet it is physically separate from Europe and the United States. And there are some protected industries. Some of them are common to what you would see in some European community countries, such as in agriculture. But there are other industries, there are labor market reforms to end some of the, or at least to reduce some of the rigidities in the labor force. The other thing which is unique to Israel is there is a growing sector of ultra-Orthodox. Many years ago, they were perhaps 3 or 4% of the population, now 10 to 15%, and it will grow over time. That part of the population does not participate as needed in the labor force, actually more so for the men than the women. And this is an issue that has to be addressed long term.
Thank you so much. We'll come back to you with more questions in the next round. Allow me to introduce Professor Zvi Eckstein, head of Aharon Economic Policy Institute in Reichman University. Very welcome to you, Professor Eckstein. There is clearly some pressure on the domestic market. Some of them, Professor Blass already touched upon them briefly, but what is the impact of the war on Israeli economy at international level? Professor Blass talked about budget deficits, rising budget deficit. I would imagine, given the dynamics of Israeli economy, there would be some reliance on foreign debt, issuing and selling bond in the international market. There would be some reliance on foreign investment. On trade, of course, is a natural part of integration of any economy into the global system. What is your assessment on that aspect, and in terms of the impact of the war?
Well, the Israeli foreign exchange market is heavily dependent on the export of the high-tech sector, which account to about 53% of the total export, and it has been growing. And it has actually, the level through the war has stayed, continued to stay there, and there is no damage, although a large percentage of about 10 to 12% of the workers in this sector are on reserves. But the sector overall hasn't been affected besides the foreign investment. Foreign investment affect one segment in the high-tech sector, mainly the startup, which is only 10% of the high-tech sector. And it went down relative to the huge increase in 21 and 22, but it's still positive. It's still there. And the threat is that this investment may actually dry up and block the what we call the startup part of the high-tech sector. But overall, we have a balance of payment surplus, and the main cause has been in the foreign exchange market is that the shekel get weaker, and that's mainly due to capital mobility out of Israel. So Israeli citizens and foreigners reduce their investment in Israeli stocks. The other aspect is that the interest rate on raising debt abroad went up by almost 1.5 point interest percentage, and that's increased the cost. But overall, we should remember that Israel debt financing in the foreign market is relatively small, and the demand has been still, with the increase in the rate, has been still positive and strengthening the economy. The rating companies, of course, reacted on reducing the rating, and which is consistent with this increase in the interest rate on the FX market. Domestically, actually, the interest rate hasn't been gone so much. So that's, I think, the main aspect. So it's kind of balanced, but there is a surplus, and the balance of payment surplus actually keep the economy to be very strong and resilient to a big shock. And the Houthis and the other disruptions are very minor. They affect all the Mediterranean countries similarly, and basically it is not a huge impact on the trade of the economy, and not on export for sure, but also on import. It's a minor impact, and the boats have to go around, etc., through around Africa, and they come, and it's a little bit more expensive, but it's not tremendous impact. In terms of affecting the gas, as long as there is no intensified war in the north, so far there hasn't been a big shift. If there would be an intensified war in the north with the Hezbollah, then that's a big threat, and the gas pumping there is going to stop for at least a month and a half, and that's a problem, and that's a problem for Israel, for Jordan, for Egypt. So we shall see what would happen in the north in the next few weeks.
Thank you very much. I will come back to you with some questions about the Israeli tech sector, but thank you very much for mentioning the gas sector because our next speaker, Rachel Ziemba, who is an adjunct senior fellow at Center for New American Security, is a global macroeconomist and an expert on global energy markets. Very welcome to you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Israel media reported that if the crisis in the as the area mentioned, if the crisis in the north parts of Israel intensifies, Israel gas facilities might be shut down, electricity supply might have to switch to operate on fuel or coal. Israel have been, as was mentioned, exporting gas to Egypt and Jordan, which increased, in fact, last year by 25% despite the crisis. What is your assessment on the impact of the war on Israel's energy sector? And I'm tempted to use your expertise while we are on this panel, even though we want to remain focused on Israel, but give us a little bit of more context on the global market as well. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Sure. Let me start with Israel, where Professor Eckstein sort of left off, which was to highlight the risks, in sort of expanding the front to the north. I think just as we were starting this webinar, there was breaking news that flashed across my phone about targets being hit in southern Lebanon. We'll see. I think it also takes something that the other panelists have noted, which is to sort of say that I think we need to distinguish between current production and future potential in the energy sector. So we did see in the first weeks following October 7th, as the sort of campaign began in Gaza, we did see one of Israel's gas fields offshore, the Tamar field, being temporarily shut down for security concerns. That reopened about a month later. As you noted, Sarah, for the year as a whole, not only did Israeli natural gas exports increase, but production was up about 14% for the year as a whole. That obviously has positive implications for the Israeli budget, offsetting some of those other price increases. It also has a long-term benefit. A portion of Israel's natural gas revenues go into savings, into its sovereign fund for sort of future investments and generation. So it's an improvement to the balance of payments and the balance of investment. So there are questions about the sort of pathway of the conflict and whether that will result. Now, Israel, a couple of things have happened. One is that, if anything, the government has sort of pushed back on some of the timelines of reducing the role of coal in the power sector. That is a rational response in conflict. In some ways. But they've also we had in the last month or so a day where almost 50% of Israeli power came from renewable sources, mostly solar. So there is a mixed story here. There is more domestic redundancy sort of in the system, but there are risks that specific fields, specific facilities might come offline, and that's something that I think the government is very much hedging against. Long term, I think there's some important questions. Israel was already thinking about ways to reduce its reliance on Egyptian liquefaction facilities for LNG exports to third countries. I think that will probably increase that desire to have more domestic capabilities. Some of the additional supplies that were maybe penciled in by gas companies to come online in first half of 2024 or later in 2024, those look to be a little bit delayed. But overall, this is a sector that, in part because it's capital intensive, not labor intensive, because some of the operations are offshore, that has been manageable. Now, looking ahead, the conflict, I think, has been another challenge to plans to further develop Eastern Mediterranean gas dynamics. There's a lot of question marks there, but I think Israel, the companies involved, are still committed to deploying these resources. But it's probably more Israel's neighbors that the conflict has put a delay in. What's notable, of course, is that Egypt, despite having the resources of its own, if anything, is more reliant on fuel from Israel than it was. Now, I don't want to abuse my time, but you did ask also about the global environment. The global environment has been, on the energy side, has been, I think, struck by two different factors. One, the concern and geopolitical risks around a conflict in the Middle East, but a recognition that a lot of the conflict has not directly hit global energy supply. Right, you have Iran more involved in conflicts that indirectly at first, and then directly the loss of the Suez Canal for some particularly goods tankers more so than, or goods vessels, has meant an increase in demand for some sorts of fuel as there's a redirection. All of the impact, but that's something that the global oil market adjusted to. I think there have been a number of people out there in the global market that have said, why aren't we seeing prices, even higher than they are? There's a conflict in the Middle East. I think it's important to always come back to, first of all, that the global oil market is maybe not the only barometer of risk. And secondly, that we are operating at a time when there is a lot of excess capacity in global oil markets, notably in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are among the OPEC countries that are sort of doing most of the restraint. And unless you look at some very extreme scenarios, like a blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, which is always something you have to put some sort of risk on. I think if there really was a meaningful outage, I think that that there would be those supplies. One factor that I think has kept prices, sort of prices low and reduced, or not low, lower than they could be, is the fact that the Iran-Saudi Arabia détente agreement not to strike each other has held up, right? The one brokered by China a bit over a year ago. And so I think that has reduced the risk that the Houthis would, or Iranian actors would, strike Saudi energy infrastructure. And so that's a factor at, sort of at play. So meaningful impacts, particularly in adjusting to the closure to some vessels of the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, implications for investment projects there, but it's been something the global oil markets have adjusted to. And one reason they've done that, we may get to sanctions and sanctions enforcement later, but that has been a factor. But the other is that non-OPEC plus countries like the United States, like Brazil, production has been increasing, and the US sanctions enforcement has tilted towards keeping oil on the market from adversaries, but paying them less for it. And so I think those things together have meant that we've seen volatility in oil prices, but maybe not as much of a persistent increase in oil prices as some might have expected back in the fall.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We'll come back to you with the question of sanctions. I would like to go back to our previous speakers for some follow-ons. Professor Eckstein, you talked about the Israeli tech sector, and of course, Israeli tech sector is a very important sector for the economy. Israel is one of the world's most innovative economies. As you mentioned, about 12% of the workforce is hired in the sector. 53% of total export comes from tech sector. Which countries are the main sort of partners in this sector for Israel? And also, you talked about the decline of value of shekel. Theoretically, that could also be a good thing for Israeli export because it might encourage export. So, what's your take on the sort of longer term impact in terms of what is happening? Of course, many things are still uncertain, as all three speakers have acknowledged that. But if you were to draw a picture of how would within the next 6 months things remain unchanged, crisis in Gaza continues and there is no major escalation, what would be your assessment on the tech sector?
Okay, thank you very much. The tech sector is the locomotive and the platform for the Israeli economy, exceptional all the world. 12% is almost, the other country below us is about 11% or 10% of the labor force. And really, the size of the high-tech sector, and high-tech is defined as revenues going to R&D is above 8%. The high-tech sector in Israel is divided as follows. Half of it is full companies, and the production there hasn't been reduced. They are very diversified intermarket, a lot to the US market. There is no reduction to the US market, providing services, etc. 12% is actually defense expenditures, which are also high-tech related. And there is a huge growth, not only from demand from the Israeli army, but also demand from European countries. We are increasing their defense expenditures substantially and are based on Israeli modern technology. 20% of the high-tech sector is R&D centers of all large corporations, and that has not been going down as we know now, and actually some of the cyber even increased. The main sector that affected is the startup sector, is affected by the investment, which went down, and I would expect the investment will go down more in the near future as long as the war continues, and that would have a long-term negative impact because the startup part is actually an engine to the whole companies, etc. The main threat and the main reason investment come to Israel in all the dimension is the high quality of our labor force, high quality of high-tech occupation or high-tech ability, which comes from different direction, both from the academia, but also from the army and other sources. And that's the main threat if the people who come back from reserves and young people would find Israel not a safe place to live in, and they would move. And this is a very movable industry. So far, we don't hear anything of that direction. Another threat, of course, is that the R&D centers, like Google, Facebook, Meta, Amazon, etc., their R&D centers would, Intel, which is a huge company in Israel, would decide to reduce their activity in R&D and IP production in Israel, and that would be a real threat. So far, as long as Israel is supported in general with the American support and the Western democracy support, I don't see that would happen in the near future. But it depends very much how this war would end and how Israelis feel in terms of safety living in Israel and how Israel would be evaluated by rating companies, which affecting board decisions, and how Israel would be affected presumably by other Western economies as a country and in general. So it's very important for the Israeli economy, the high-tech sector, and strategically keeping the high-tech sector performing in this capacity is actually a challenge for this government. And I hope the government take it in consideration in all the military, foreign policy, and economic decision in the near future.
Thank you so much. Yes, we had a quick exchange back and forth with Professor Blass in terms of, and I asked him to elaborate a little bit on the differences or between the type of reforms that Israeli economy requires in compare with other Middle Eastern economies. And one of the points that now you raised, which is very interesting, it highlights another key difference between Israeli economy and other Middle Eastern economies, which is the gap between the labor market desire and the quality of the labor force in most of the countries across the region is quite wide. Most of the countries in the region have a huge brain drain issue. The highly skilled workers of bigger economies in the region don't really work in their home countries. They tend to migrate in a search of better life work condition, which is exactly opposite, at least so far has been opposite of the dynamics in Israel. I want to go back to Professor Blass to ask some questions about government policies, but I also want to bring Rachel now into the conversation again about the question of sanctions. Professor Blass, I'll come back to you in few minutes. Rachel, you mentioned sanctions, and sanctions seem to be the quickest response to military conflicts these days. The U.S. is
not only military ones, but yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, true. Yes, yes. I had Russia in Ukraine post Ukraine war in mind. Of course, Iran's even before Iran's direct attacks to Israel, Iran's nuclear program was also a reason for sanctions on several other countries. But the US has recently again talked about renewing sanctions on Iran and also, maybe for the first time ever, if I'm not mistaken, designating some of the individuals in relation to the crisis in Gaza, which are the first of such kind. What is your assessment on this? So I would like again you to bring both countries, if you don't mind, into the conversation and sort of maybe compare and contrast. Even if you want to bring Russia into the conversation, would be also fine because we're very keen on learning about your views on the sanctions and how they are really achieving anything, if at all. Thank you.
Yeah. So, you're completely right that sanctions are one of the sort of key tools that the U.S., but also European allies, G7 allies, have used for a range of triggers, including domestic human rights issues, cyber security threats, the drug trafficking, the list goes on. I throw in drug trafficking because when you look at when are sanctions effective in getting the target to change behavior, actually drug traffickers or drug trafficking offenses often are those that more quickly people are sanctioned and then they get out of the drugs trade. At least those people, new people, spark up. But that's a different philosophical story we can talk about another time. So if we think about this, and there are a variety of triggers or sort of goals for sanctions in mind, when there's already a conflict on, for example, with Russia's expansion of its invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, the goal quickly shifted to degrading the military capabilities. The chance for deterrence was over. The chance for convincing Putin to change course or the regime to change course seemed like a lost cause, and it really became about degradation. And I would say that a lot of the very extensive sanctions regime in place on Iran today is also in this logic of degrading military capacities, degrading resilience capacities. Now, as you know, I mean, you're an expert in these issues as well. Where Iran and regional economies are concerned, Iran has had a lot of resilience, has developed a lot of networks. It's worked with other sanctioned economies, not only Russia, but Venezuela, even parts of China, to continue accessing the markets. So what I think we've seen a couple of things where, sort of Iran sanctions are concerned. So since October 7th, there have been various rounds of new sanctions relating to Iranian oil trade that supports regional partners, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. So specific vessels targeted. Now that hasn't moved the needle that much in terms of oil trade, but it did come at the same time that the US was threatening secondary sanctions towards Russia, and Chinese buyers were a little less interested in buying Iranian oil from November of last year, February of this year. They came back to the market in March, buying, maybe it's a price story. We don't fully know, but the bottom line is that what the circumstance, despite this enforcement action, the circumstance that developed over the last year between the US and Iran was one that allowed more Iranian oil to come on the market. Now, it's less easy for Iran to actually access and use those funds. And even the humanitarian aid or humanitarian funds are harder to use, but they are definitely earning money. Now, two things have happened in the last week that I think are relevant to note. There was a round of new US sanctions on Iran. Most of those were pretty targeted towards the drone and UAV industry. One thing that caught my eye was that there was a group of steel companies. And that, I think, is the US trying to hit Iranian non-oil exports and the like. But the other one is that over the weekend, as part of approving the military assistance to Israel, to Ukraine, to Taiwan, were sort of congressionally mandated new sanctions. Now, my view on this, shared with many in the marketplace, is that a lot of these measures are, we're not really needed as new measures. It's more a function of enforcement. So there's a lot of discretion from the US government in exactly how they will implement these measures. And my view is that now that the trade is so illicit, goes through so many shell companies in the UAE, in Iran, in Malaysia, in China, often many different banks. So they're intermediaries that are making a lot of money on this. And that also makes it a bit harder for the US to enforce sanctions compared to the circumstance that was in play, say, in 2010, when most Iranian trade to Asia and Europe had a US financial nexus point. So I think we might see a bit of tightening. Is it going to change the minds of the Iranian regime? I doubt it. I've overstepped my time, but I want to just say 1 minute on the sanctions on Israeli citizens. You're right. This is the first time that I can think of that there were sanctions of this sort on Israeli individuals. Now, they are individuals in the West Bank, and it is in response to the violence in the West Bank. So there've been a few rounds of sanctions in the last few months to individuals, then their farms, and most recently, the financial funds that were set up to support these actors, these individuals, some of whom lost their Israeli banking access, not just global banking access. So in my view, often sanctions on individuals don't necessarily move the needle. I think critics would say this was sort of, a political act domestically to say, well, we're doing something about the violence. If anything, I would imagine it only encourages parts of the governing coalition in Israel to be more committed to their approach. So it remains to be seen, but I think in the context of the U.S. being the largest supplier and source of capital, public, but also private, it is an important signaling device. And going forward, there definitely is a move in the United States to more greatly condition the aid that is sent to Israel. These sanctions, I think, are a part of that.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I would like to go back to Asha, if I may. A lot has been covered now about the impact of the war, the government response, the Israeli economy's resilience, the role of labor force. But one point that really remained with me was your comment about the much needed reform in certain aspects. Of course, the question of Orthodox citizens of Israel is a more of a long-term sort of domestic and maybe to some extent less related to the current crisis, although it is indeed related. But what are the other reforms, what would you, if you were the head of Israeli central bank, what would be the immediate reform that you would initiate in response to the ongoing crisis?
Well, first of all, the party responsible for reforms is not really head of the central bank. I would say it would be the government and the Minister of Finance. I just briefly want to touch upon what you said about the ultra-Orthodox being more of a long-term issue. It actually is a short-term issue as well, because the issue of the ultra-Orthodox in the labor market is also very much related to the draft exemptions that the ultra-Orthodox have for the most part. And this during a period where reserve soldiers are going to be serving many more weeks per year, and also serving in reserves to a much older age. And I think it's probably the case that some of the high-tech sectors, which we are so dependent upon, are probably staffed by a fair amount of reserves. So I think it's both a long-term issue but a short-term issue. In terms of the reforms, some of the issues relate to opening up the Israeli market to imports, doing without regulations. One of the things which is important, while the Israeli high-tech sector is very important, there have been probably less of the kind of spillovers we would like into the trade and services. And some of this is related to tax reform. So, for example, in Israel, only industry gets accelerated depreciation. Services and trade organizations don't. And as a result, that part of the economy, which is still a very large part of the economy, is undercapitalized and not especially efficient. And making these kind of changes means taking on strong interest groups who, for the moment, are very happy that only industry and, let's say, tourism get these tax benefits. But that's bad for the Israeli economy as a whole. It also means directing government aid away from non-productive sectors of society, getting education reform in some of the ultra-Orthodox schools, but not just there, and to create a situation where the workforce is better educated in the long run. I think there is some cause for optimism. So, for example, 10 days ago, when many in the world press marveled at the success of the interception of the missiles coming from Iran, this may have a spillover into a real substantial increase, both in the military industry, exports of the military industry, but also in spillovers. In the past, some of these one-time events have had spillover effects which were not initially predicted. So I think we might see some good developments in that area as well long term.
Thank you so much. You touched upon the one of the questions that was already raised by the audience, and that was to do with the impact of these sort of one-time events, very expensive nevertheless. Various estimates confirmed billions of dollars were spent on that operation from Iranian side, and on the interception operation also from Israeli and Israeli allies side. Now, if anybody would like to add anything to that particular question, by all means, I would love to hear from you. But I also I usually end these panels with asking the speakers to make policy recommendations. But I think in this environment of chaos that we are seeing, making policy recommendation to anyone would be a little bit long shot. I would like to turn then the question, reframe it a little bit. For many years, many political economists, many analysts have argued that economic integration, Wandel durch Handel, change through trade, building economic ties, could decrease the risk of possible confrontation and crisis in the future. Do you think that statement is still valid in this current environment in the region? would you at all foresee any possible strengthening of economic relations as a remedy to similar sort of events in the future? So
I
let's
think,
start, yes, with you, please. Go ahead.
in fact, I think that just the opposite. I think that actually um, the point of the West Bank and Gaza standard of living relative to Israel is a huge gap. Uh, this is, the gap. Gaza is now in a disaster, and the West Bank still has been growing in the last few years, but GDP per capita is 1/8 or 1/10 of Israel, and therefore um, the relationship has been that basically 20% of the GDP, 17% of the workforce were working from Gaza and the West Bank, mainly the West Bank and in Israel before the war. And what has happened is the Israeli government stopped it completely, which basically is a disastrous impact on the West Bank and Gaza. So the potential conflict in the future actually provide a source for instability. And the fact that what we need is actually, I think, less dependent in general. Actually, it should have been done not like a huge impact after the war, but less dependent because the risk of additional conflict in the future still exists, and it provides instability to both economies, uh, especially the dependence of the West Bank and Gaza on Israel and employment in Israel, and the sector specific in Israel, like construction and others, on this labor force, uh, does not reduce the tension, because the tension doesn't come from the economic reason. The tension is a political, cultural, religious tension that would continue to be. And I think the way we need to have the relationship is very much like what we have developed with Egypt and Jordan. And look how stable are the peace process with Jordan and Egypt. And therefore, in a strategic view, I think that the economic relationship that we have developed with Egypt and Jordan should be the same with the West Bank and Gaza in the future, whatever political arrangement will be there.
Thank you so much. Asha, shall we come to you? Would you like to chime in?
Well, I think there may be something to that point of view, but it's also the case that in this current conflict, the economic interests of Israel and, let's say, Egypt are aligned. In other words, they're hurt by the Houthis, and we're hurt by the Houthis, even less, in fact. And the natural gas is another factor. And the fact that the Saudis are seeing what happened 10 days ago, and while it's true that Israel received assistance from the West, obviously Israel was the major factor. And I imagine a country like Saudi Arabia is asking itself, what would happen if 300 missiles were shot at us? So there could be a different situation with the Palestinians, but with the Arab countries, the fact that
I say keep the relationship with the Arab countries the way they are. Separate economies and trade when you need, but not make any sector completely dependence between the two of us. That's a huge
the issue is it's a tricky situation because the proximity is really close. It's not like a neighbor that's 100 miles away. It's in some cases, like here in Jerusalem, it's almost down the block. So it's not entirely clear how that could be done, and that it especially takes into account the fact that there are Israeli Arabs who are certainly part of the Israeli economy, and they have sometimes family relations and other relations with Palestinians. So to sort of have a clear delineated border between the two where there's a separation could be possible in some utopian world. I'm not sure whether it is in practice possible. I do agree that Israel should be less dependent on the Arab labor force. In fact, from the West Bank. In fact, in the last 2 years, the number of workers coming in from the West Bank to Israel have gone up dramatically and almost doubled in 2 or 3 years. So, maybe there's some kind of happy medium where the numbers don't increase, but that there isn't a complete development.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, we come to you, Rachel.
I don't have much to add except to give a little global perspective on the question you asked, Sarah, about this sort of question mark about trade leading to sort of peace and security. I think it's a harder case to make right now when you've had this sort of discrediting of the idea that bringing countries like China into the global trading system would lead to alignment on political issues. I mean, I think definitely, as sort of the US is thinking about sort of how to stabilize and secure supply lines, I think that argument has become more challenging. I think that both of my co-panelists have raised important points about sort of building on certain degrees of economic interdependence. You have to, because you're next door. But not assuming that the economic interdependence would necessarily drive the politics. In fact, often it can be the other way, the other way around. So I guess also we're in this new phase where it's also a question of what sort of economic relationship around the world. I think you're seeing the US and European Union focus more on standards, whether it's labor, whether it's environmental, and trying to think about how can one sort of really assess not only trade in and of itself, not only sort of, outsourcing and redirection, but how can one share kind of, economic principles. And that can be a tough sell. There can be cases where that perhaps works, where there's alignment. But I think we're in a moment where a lot of rules and terms of trade are being rewritten. We're seeing a lot more, a greater role in the global economy of illicit financial networks because of sort of sanctions. And so I think this is a bit of a murky time. So interest-based sort of trade and political decisions is probably something we're going to be seeing more of. But that's maybe a topic for another time.
Thank you. No, absolutely.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. But if anything, we are seeing more examples of otherwise, in a sense that like-minded states, after having political alliance and like-minded policies, they then start building economic networks. This morning I read that a trade and economic delegation from North Korea are heading Tehran to meet with the Iranians. So. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time, really appreciate your insights, and I'm looking forward to other occasions to cross paths with you and have continue these conversations with you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.